Welcome to Your Health in 15 Minutes. My name is Dr. Wallace and I'll be your host. April is Autism Acceptance Month, and today we have Dr. Jackson with us, who is going to talk about all things autism. Dr. Jackson, can you please introduce yourself?
Yes, so my name is Dr. Kaitlin Jackson. I serve as an assistant professor of special ed here at Fayetteville State. I also serve as the university's chair of our Autism Advisory Council, which is kind of a university-wide committee that we have, and we really try to provide some community supports and some PD and things like that. So I serve as the chair of that committee as well.
Great. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor.
Yeah. So tell me exactly, what is autism? What are some of the common behaviors, some diagnostic criteria?
Sure. Well, I guess first I just want to start by saying that there's no right or wrong way to kind of talk about autism. Some people kind of prefer person first language and saying person with autism. Some people prefer identity first, where you say autistic person. There's no right or wrong. It's really just kind of a preference. But in terms of autism, it really presents really differently in every person, hence the term spectrum, the word spectrum and the ASD, that term. But what we do know is that ASD really refers to kind of a collection of neurological differences, and those differences culminate in three different kind of buckets, I like to call them, or developmental domains of how those differences present in terms of how a person communicates, how they socialize, kind of how they behave and things like that. So we don't really know what causes it. We just know that there's some genetic and environmental interaction components. It's also very common for a person on the spectrum to experience other conditions as well, or comorbidities. So for example, they may have autism and epilepsy or ADHD, intellectual disability. Sleep disorders are also pretty common. Feeding disorders are also really common. Any type of motor impairment. So it's pretty common for those things to coexist. But those three kind of buckets that I was referring to, the first of those is really on the behavioral side, so repetitive and restrictive behaviors. So you may see people on the spectrum kind of like hand flapping, doing those sorts of things, or like rocking back and forth, or manipulating an object like this. We call that stimming or self-stimulation. So those kind of repetitive and restrictive behaviors or motor movements is a pretty classic characteristic. Another under this domain of behavior is sensory input. So either a heightened reaction or a dampened reaction to any type of sensory input. So that could be audio, visual, touch, anything like that. So you may see kids, who are really sensitive to like a tag on the shirt, to where it's incredibly distressing, and it's really hard to kind of move past that. Or these really bright lights or really loud noises. Those sorts of behaviors are pretty common. Another characteristic under that behavior is being very inflexible with routines and having very strict routines, to the point again of being really inflexible and it being very difficult to kind of deviate from that routine in a way. And the last thing to kind of mention in terms of behavior is very fixated interests. So, it's really common for kids to have kind of their area of interest, right? Like a lot of little boys like trains, and a lot of kids liked playing with dolls or things like that. But when that is kind of the only thing that they want to play with, or they only will kind of gravitate towards that, and that's all they want to talk about or play with, and to a point of exclusion of other things, those types of interests can be kind of isolating and restrictive in how they play. So that's kind of the first developmental domain, is that repetitive and restrictive behaviors. And the next is communication. And I really encourage folks to move away from thinking of these as deficits and more just as differences, because folks will communicate in a wide variety of ways, and we do that all the time, right? Even as neurotypical people. And so it's important, I think, to shift from viewing these as deficits and more so just understanding that folks on the spectrum just communicate in different ways. And so one of those things may be differences in how they perceive nonverbal body language or eye contact or gestures and things like that, because you learn a lot about what someone's trying to tell you by their body language, or those nonverbals, right? And those can be really difficult for folks on the spectrum to kind of interpret and then use that information, right? Another thing that's pretty common is repeated speech, or echolalia. So, you might say, "Hi, how are you?" You might say, "Hi, how are you?" and then answer the question. So that kind of repeated speech, or kind of processing or acquiring language in whole phrases rather than just kind of putting things together. They may associate language as a whole phrase, basically. You also will just see a wide variety of levels of vocal speech. So some folks on the spectrum, have a little bit of vocal speech, and maybe they also use a communication device. Some folks don't use any type of vocal speech, and they only use a device. And so we call those devices alternative and augmentative communication devices. You mostly will see kids, with an iPad or a tablet, and they use like an app on those devices. And that tends to either supplement their existing levels of speech and just kind of, add in a bit more, or replace it. But it is pretty common for autistic kids to use those types of devices, and they are incredibly helpful in how they do communicate. They don't hinder their vocal speech development at all. They do, in fact, do the opposite. They help them continue to learn more and more communication. And then the last developmental domain is more on the social side. And that part of that stems from the differences in communication, because we use communication a lot in our social relationships, right? And so it's pretty common for them to have differences in how they interact socially. And part of that may come from initiating social exchanges, approaching somebody and saying hello, or asking questions or answering questions, or on the other side, reciprocity. So if someone's trying to engage with them, they may not have this reciprocal conversation that you would expect from a neurotypical person. That doesn't mean that they can't have a social exchange. It just means that maybe we're not talking about what they want to talk about, or we're not, communicating the way that is ideal for them. And so if those differences exist in how we communicate and then how we use that communication to socialize, it's pretty common for kids on the spectrum to engage in play in different ways as well. And that can be kind of a misconception that folks think like autistic kids just play by themselves. They don't want to play with other kids. And that's not true, right? They just do it in different ways. And it all kind of builds on each other. So even though I kind of, at least in my classes, I kind of introduce these as buckets of developmental domains. They don't exist in isolation, because so much of how we communicate is important for our social relationships, and so much of our behavior is important for social relationships as well. But I think it just really comes down to understanding those as differences rather than deficits, because if we constantly view kids on the spectrum from this deficit-based perspective, we're not going to appreciate all of the strengths that they bring to the table. And so often there are so many strengths that they do bring. So I think it's just important to shift our language from deficits that you may see like in a textbook to just understanding and appreciating those as differences.
Okay. Thank you so much for kind of explaining that a little bit more. How common is autism?
Very common. So as of March of 2023, the CDC released some updated guidelines and prevalence data that estimated 1 in 36 kids in the United States. And that's, you probably know 36 people, right?
Exactly.
You definitely know
that
more than
is very
36
common.
people. And so part of, I think, what is important to unpack there is that it's not necessarily that more and more kids have just been born and are then diagnosed. It's more so that the diagnostic criteria has changed quite a bit in recent years. In recent decades, really, it has changed a significant amount. And so where we used to, classify Asperger's as a separate diagnosis, now it's just kind of under that same umbrella of autism spectrum disorder as, maybe level 1 autism, or, folks who don't have as intensive of support needs. And so just kind of the differences in how diagnostic criteria has changed has led to that prevalence rate. Because if you look over in the past couple of decades, it's gotten higher and higher and higher. And folks are kind of thinking, in a panic that, oh my goodness, something, about the population has grown. It's just that diagnostic criteria has changed, and it's become much more inclusive of the spectrum, right, of all the different levels of how people present.
Okay. What treatments or interventions are typically done for a child that is diagnosed with autism?
Yeah, so ABA, or applied behavior analysis, is really kind of the go-to evidence-based treatment. It's basically based on principles of behavior change through principles like reinforcement, that you basically seek to change behaviors in a socially meaningful way. So we don't want kids just to exist in a box, right? We don't want them to just mimic behaviors because they exist in a box, but more so, what's going to be functional for them in their life and their community and their independent living and things like that. So ABA is really kind of the go-to treatment and evidence-based practice. And there are truly many, many practices that stem from ABA that we use kind of outside of that clinical setting. Like for example, if you went to Starbucks this morning, right? And you trade in your stars, like they scan your phone or whatever, and you get your stars, and then you get so many stars, and you get to trade it in for a free coffee or whatever. We use principles like that all the time in our life, and ABA, when done in a really good and ethical way, seeks to make that behavior change really meaningful and functional, rather than you just need to copy me because this is what neurotypical people do and we're trying to make you fit in a box, right? That's not really what the goal should be. So evidence-based treatments oftentimes stem from those, especially principles of reinforcement. So ABA is kind of the main go-to that we use quite a lot, but really anything under the verbal de-escalation umbrella, and there's many, many things that fall, and many examples of strategies that fall under that umbrella, but verbal de-escalation really just seeks to non-invasively de-escalate a child. One thing that I say to my students all the time is that an escalated adult cannot de-escalate an escalated child, right? Or, like I say to my son if he's having some feelings, you can't fight fire with fire. And so the goal of verbal de-escalation is really just to remain calm and cool and collected, and to just kind of bring them down to a place where you're able to have a conversation, and then, everyone is entitled to feeling mad or angry, and so how can we just kind of get to a space where we can talk about those and move forward in solution focused once we're ready to talk about it, right? So that's kind of what verbal de-escalation seeks to do, in a way that doesn't require any physical hands-on, which typically just escalates the situation, as you know. There are also several related services that we often recommend quite a bit. So like occupational therapy is super helpful, especially with those sensory differences, fine motor challenges and things like that. A lot of kids also will receive speech language services for those communication differences as well. So in speech language therapy, they will learn how to use their ASC device. If they have existing levels of vocal speech, they'll work on to supplement that quite a bit. And then there's, of course, it's going to be dependent on the child. So some kids are going to need, adapted physical education at school, or maybe they're going to need some physical therapy. It's totally going to depend on the individual child. But occupational therapy and speech language therapy are probably the most common related services that are available, in school, outside of school as well. Okay.
Are there any resources within our community here that you would recommend?
Yes, absolutely. Well, as I mentioned in the beginning, FSU has an autism advisory council, and we hope to provide, at least we try to provide, many PD and training to the local community, and a lot of resources as well. So we are a great resource. We have our own website that is housed under the College of Ed here. The Gilmore Center is part of Fayetteville, or Cumberland County Parks and Rec, and the Gilmore Center is an adapted Parks and Rec center, and they have so many amazing programs, that not necessarily autism specifically, but they have many, many amazing programs, sports programs and weekly, recreation programs basically that are meant for anyone with a disability, basically. So it is a very accessible. The entire center is amazing, and I recommend them all the time. And some other really good that are more autism focused would be Autism Society of Cumberland County or of North Carolina. They have many resources on the website that are available all the time. Webinars for parents. If you have many frequently asked questions, there's probably a webinar for it, or at least we can point you in the right direction. And the Cumberland County chapter is really active. They have weekly parent meetups, parent support groups. They have they're really active, so they have a lot of other resources that they can point you to as well. If you have a specific area of need or a specific question, they would be a great resource as well. Okay.
Are there any myths about autism that you kind of want to shed light on?
I can get in a soapbox about this, and so now you're giving me a literal soapbox to talk about this. So a few decades ago, a very unfortunate person spread completely falsified data that vaccines cause autism. There's an ingredient in vaccines specifically that cause autism, and that is completely false. So let me just say for the record, even though it's been said many, many, many times over, that was falsified data. He lost his medical license, and he is no longer practicing because that obviously has had some pretty intense consequences. So there is that's a really, really common myth that there's something in vaccines that cause autism, and that is incorrect information. Another pretty common myth is that something along the lines of bad parenting, or a long time ago, in like the 1900s, it was referred to as refrigerator mothers, really cold, unfeeling. Those kind of really just kind of cold mothers cause autism, and that is also false. I think it's also helpful to kind of point out that we can't make generalizations, and that's not necessarily a myth, but just something that is worth mentioning, that because of the nature of the spectrum, we can't make generalizations about how folks present. Like, they will always struggle to maintain eye contact. Well, that's not necessarily true, because everyone is different, and so you may have differences in how you use eye contact, but that generalization is something that we can't say, just because of the nature of how different people present. Same thing with communication and social skills. I think it's just important that we be mindful of the language that we use instead of making those generalizations. I think it's more helpful just to talk about how individual folks present and based on their levels of support needs. In the autism space, people typically say like levels 1, 2, 3, or 4, based on the levels of intensity of support needs, based on how much support and across how many settings and things like that.
I'm assuming with 4 being the most.
Yes. So I think that's probably worth mentioning, just because I think that's pretty common that people just kind of make those generalizations, and we can't do that just because there's a huge spectrum, literally a spectrum, of how people present. And so that's not necessarily a myth, but I think that's just something that is worth talking about as well. But my soapbox related to the vaccines that is, I think, probably has been the most problematic myth that has had really long-standing consequences.
Are there any strategies that you would recommend for someone who is caring for a child with autism, whether it's a parent, a caregiver, maybe in the daycare, in healthcare settings? Any type of strategies you'd suggest?
Yes, I have many. So if I run out of time, we can share some more later. So the first that I would say is always use visual aids. People generally, we use visual all the time, right? When driving to campus, you probably abided by some stop signs and stoplights, right? We use visual aids all the time in our life, but folks who process information differently really depend on those to make the information really concrete. So as many visuals as you possibly can, whether that's a visual schedule of here's what we're going to be doing all day long today, or it's a first we're going to be doing this and then we're going to do this. I know that you really want that iPad, and so first we're going to finish up, we're going to finish reading this chapter, and then we can play on the iPad. The more visuals that you can incorporate, whether that's at home, if you have to, go through your list of the chores that you have to do, or your bedtime routine, or in the classroom, visual aids are incredibly helpful. Another thing to think about too is what we know about how kids behaviorally express their areas of interest. Incorporating those is really helpful. So if you have a child who has those specific areas of interest that they will probably talk to you about, or they'll have a lot of stuffed animals about it, or toys, incorporating those as much as you can, and get those, whatever those areas of interest are, get those into your conversations, into your classroom or your learning, into your de-escalation if you're able to do those sorts of things. Another thing that I think is helpful is just to offer choices. And again, people like choices even as adults, right? We use choices all the time. We want to be able to exercise our own choices. And so I think just offering choices as much as you can is helpful too, because as parents, I think we oftentimes offer choices within boundaries, and that is incredibly helpful here. I know that this maybe isn't something you want to do, and so here's a couple of choices of maybe the order in which you do them or the way in which you do them, and those choices I think can go a long way. A couple of more specific things that, again, you can do at home or at school will be things like video modeling or social stories. And those two things those are evidence-based practices. There's lots of research that suggests to kind of show they're effective in a variety of ways to teach academic skills in the classroom, to teach functional skills, how do I brush my teeth, to how do I cross the street safely, those sorts of things. But essentially a social story is pictures and a story that you write in social narrative of teaching a specific skill or going through the motions of doing something. And the video model is similar, but you are watching a video of someone performing the skill. or doing the task or whatever it is. And again, it's anchoring the fact that we need those concrete experiences for kids or young adults who process information differently. It brings the information to a very concrete level that they can replicate and model themselves. That leverages technology. We know that technology is very friendly to a lot of people. And I think a couple things that just go without saying is to provide reinforcement as much as you can. When kids on the spectrum are experiencing challenges, it is still important that we offer reinforcement, and even when you're doing your best or you're trying to do the behavior, I think it's important that we still provide a lot of reinforcement, and that's going to depend on what the child prefers. Some kids really love to be tickled, and you can kind of get in their face and tickle them and have a great time. Some kids just really love candy, or they love snacks, or they love just being able to go play outside or play on the iPad or watch TV. What is reinforcing to individual people is going to depend. So I think just being mindful that making sure that our reinforcement is targeted to that particular child is going to make it more effective, right? But I think that just goes without saying that the more that we can provide reinforcement, the more we can kind of keep the ball rolling or keep that behavior momentum going once they do start, if it's in the classroom, they're working on an academic skill, or at home they're doing whatever it was that the work demand was that was presented. I think in terms of sensory overload, it can be difficult, I think, to kind of de-escalate when there's a sensory related overload, essentially. So I think in those moments, if you can just redirect that sensory output somewhere else, so if you can remove the sensory, whatever is, if you can turn the lights down or provide some noise canceling headphones or provide some fidgets for their hands or their legs or things like that, if you can move somewhere else that isn't so overwhelming, that's going to not always be an option, right? Sometimes we can't turn down the lights and we can't, account for those things. But when we can, I think it is really helpful just to be mindful that if you are someone who experiences sensory input in a heightened way, that's very overwhelming. And so just being mindful that if we can remove them, redirect them, that can be really helpful in preventing those meltdowns from happening when it's sensory related. And I think just being understanding that if as neurotypical people, it's very difficult for us to understand how it feels to be in those moments of sensory overload, and just being empathetic, I think, is really the first thing that we have to do, is just being, understanding that this is surely a very distressing experience. And so if we can remove some of that, that would be great. But I think that can be helpful too. And I think the last thing I would just say is, kind of goes back to what I was saying about being calm and cool and collected. There are going to be, for classroom teachers, for parents whose kids have, any levels of support needs, there are going to be times where it can be stressful and it can be challenging, and you're going to feel like, I just don't know what to do, or I'm really frustrated myself. It is fine to go take a break, like we talk about giving our kids a break, or removing them from whatever sensory input is distressing, or giving the kids a break. That's okay if we need to take a break too. And I think that Autism Society of Cumberland County, like their parent support group, is a great example of just really, you have to find your people too, because the parents are part of the autism community just as much as their children are. So I think it's just important that we have support as parents, that teachers have support, because no one exists on an island, and this community is not meant to be in isolation. And so I think that just is an important thing to remember too, that if you need to take a break and fill up your own cup, that is not time that is wasted or invaluable. So I think that's just important to remember too, that parents are part of the community, and parents need to care for themselves, and teachers too. It can be exhausting, right? When there's a lot already on our plates as teachers. There's a whole lot added every single day. There's more and more. And so I think just being mindful that we have to fill up our own cups too, and make sure that we're caring for ourselves, that goes a long way. And honor that for your students too, or for your kids. If they need a break, they should be entitled to that break, right? They're people before there are students, and they're deserving of that as well.
One last question. We are limited on time, but I want to make sure that we get this question out there. Are there any special education requirements or things that need to be done when a child goes to school with autism?
Yes. So the first, this is a myth. I should have talked about this in the myth section, but having a medical diagnosis does not automatically mean that you are educationally eligible. And that can be that's a little bit counterintuitive, I think, sometimes, but the child still has to go through the referral process and be found eligible under the special education law that our public schools special ed units abide by. So they still have to go through that process to be found eligible for special education services. And if they are, then of course they would develop an IEP or an individualized education program that kind of outlines what services they're going to receive, any accommodations and things like that. They also could get a 504 plan if an IEP is not the best fit. They could qualify for a 504 plan. But that kind of is the first step, is to formally request in writing that the parent would need to formally request that they would like an evaluation for special ed, and then the school would go through that process. And that's kind of the first step. But whatever the program is totally going to depend on that unique child's needs. So their IEP is not going to look the same as the next kid. Even if they have the same eligibility status, under autism, they're still going to have an individualized program by the nature of the IEP. But they can be served in a variety of settings. And so even though they would qualify for special ed services, that doesn't mean that they're going to be in a separate classroom. They still could spend a good chunk of their day in that general education inclusive setting. They might spend maybe half and half, maybe part of their time in there and part of the time in a different classroom. It is going to entirely depend on what they need.
Okay. Thank you so much for joining me today. It was a pleasure to have you here. So this is Your Health in 15 Minutes. I'm your host, Dr. Wallace. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.